PUCs have the power to determine three things that really matter. First is how much people pay for energy. The second is what types of energy different utilities invest in, so how utilities make their investments. And then third is oftentimes where certain projects are located. So these 200 public utility commissioners, they oversee more than $200 billion a year in utility spending. So that's $1 billion a commissioner. And that's exactly why we need to be thinking about them like they're Supreme Court justices in terms of the impact that they have over those issues.
Hey, Jeannie.
Yeah, Brew.
Who's our guest on the Energy Nerd Show today?
Today we have Charles Hua, and Charles is the founder and executive director of Power Lines.
Oh,
hey,
cool.
Charles.
Hi, Charles.
Hey, Bruce and Jeannie. Thanks for having me.
Thanks for being here.
Welcome to the show.
So tell us about this new organization. How long have you been up to it, and what are you doing?
So Power Lines is a new national nonprofit organization focused on modernizing the utility regulatory system to accelerate affordable, reliable, and clean energy for American consumers. We're particularly focused on state public utility commissions, or PUCs, and the role that they have in our energy and electricity system. And we officially launched Power Lines this past September, and we've had a ton of positive reception since. There's a lot of, I think, growing recognition about the role that PUCs play in the energy transition in terms of the role that they have in setting rates and this new load growth thing that we're hearing a lot about. And very excited to be sharing a little bit more about some of the work that we do, and also this broader question of just what do PUCs do exactly and why they matter.
Yeah, so Jeannie and I are familiar with PUCs and very much aware of why they matter. But what would you say to the Energy Nerd Show listeners are like, PUCs, huh?
Well, that's for a while the reaction that you'd get when you were talking about PUCs. I think that's changed over the last couple of years as there's been growing recognition of just how important these bodies are. The way that I like to think about them and talk about them is that they're the Supreme Court justices for energy, for our body of work. At least that's how we should be thinking about them in the energy space in terms of the importance that they have. So there's about 200 public utility commissioners across the country, across all 50 states have a commission. They go by different names. Sometimes it's PUC, sometimes it's the Public Service Commission, or PSC, or Arizona calls it the Corporation Commission. And every state is a little bit different, but by and large, PUCs have the power to determine three things that really matter. First is how much people pay for energy. The second is what types of energy different utilities invest in, so how utilities make their investments. And then third is oftentimes where certain projects are located. So these 200 public utility commissioners, they oversee more than $200 billion a year in utility spending. So that's $1 billion a commissioner. And that's exactly why we need to be thinking about them like they're Supreme Court justices in terms of the impact that they have over those issues.
And so if you care about whether power bills are, $600 a month or $500 a month, and if you care about climate and carbon emissions or power plant siting and health effects and jobs, then you should care about PUCs.
100%. And the list of objectives that PUCs will have some significant level of influence over is really broad. You mentioned a lot of them. There's also economic development. And then in this context of artificial intelligence and load growth, how that impacts anything from national security to the affordability concerns that are really popping up to the forefront. Those are just some of the many different areas in which PUC decisions impact both our everyday lives as energy consumers, but also this bigger macroeconomic picture.
That's huge. There's so much for them to cover, and they're in every state. How are you choosing to narrow your focus? You can't be doing everything.
Yeah, it's a great question. So for us, the way that we think about is just in general, where can we add value to this conversation? So we are a national organization. We do have an interest in all 50 states and what's going on. And part of the role that we see ourselves playing is trying to identify the best practices, the effective regulatory mechanisms or strategies that different states are adopting, and figuring out how we can spread those at scale across all types of states, blue, red, and everything in between. Take something like integrated distribution system planning. States of all political stripes have adopted policies like that, in part because it makes a lot of sense. We should be planning for our distribution system, especially with growth of electric vehicles and heat pumps and all different kinds of technologies that are putting new pressures and opportunities, though, on the grid. So the way that we see it is trying to understand what are some of those effective approaches that work and how can we deploy those at scale. Obviously, some of the challenges that we're talking about in terms of affordability, reliability, and how that impacts the energy transition with decarbonization objectives, those pop up to different degrees depending on the state, as well as the load growth conversation. While all of these trends are happening nationally, there are certain hotspots where this is occurring. So for instance, just on the affordability piece, certainly California has experienced significant increases in electricity rates. On the reliability piece, places as diverse as Houston to Asheville with the hurricanes to Maine, they've all struggled with some of the kind of principles of affordability and reliability that we could always take for granted. So there are some of those sorts of issues or challenges where we see this pop up in particular. And so, we're still very much in the process of identifying the very specific geographic subunits that we feel like there's an opportunity to enact some of these regulatory modernization initiatives. But in general, the way that we see it is there's a national issue here. Pretty much every state is dealing with some form of it, albeit to varying degrees. And where can we as an organization add value to this conversation by taking some of those effective strategies and approaches and employing them at scale?
So you mentioned earlier data centers and AI and load growth associated with the kind of growth, power consumption. And that is a huge issue, everywhere, or kind of. But are there particular hotspots where that's particularly pronounced and urgent? And has your organization, how do you approach it? Have you solved that one yet, Charles?
I don't know if any of us have. So, first, just taking a step back in terms of load growth, right? We haven't seen this pace of increase in electricity demand in decades, since, the 90s and early 2000s, where the internet boom created a lot of the growth in electricity demand that we saw then. I do think that we have very important lessons to be learning from how we managed that set of challenges that arguably we are overlooking in this current paradigm. So things like the role that energy efficiency plays was something that allowed us to effectively manage demand before, that I think we need to bring some of those lessons today that, in some sense, I do think are being overlooked, perhaps because there's this perception that the scale of the increase in electricity demand is so massive that how can something like efficiency solve that? Well, the point is it's not going to be one technology or one solution or one measure that's going to single-handedly tackle these issues. We need a portfolio approach, and I think that there very much is a risk of not looking back to some of our previous lessons and applying them in this context. To get at your question about where we're seeing these issues pop up, it is very much a national issue. Historically, there's been Loudoun County in Virginia, which is referred to as Data Center Alley, which has had a particular high density of data centers. But part of why a lot of the tech companies and hyperscalers are looking at all different geographies to site data centers is because there are grid constraints in Loudoun County. So we're seeing data centers pop up, anywhere from Ohio and the industrial Midwest to Georgia and the Southeast. Certainly Texas is one of the fastest growing regions in terms of load and data center development. We're seeing some pop up in the West as well. And that's really because the tech companies are increasingly realizing that the single biggest constraint to data center development is access to power, access to energy, access to electricity. And so for a lot of them, they're interested in taking power from wherever they can get. And that's a question of how much utilities and by proxy, their regulators are able to effectively plan ahead for this increase in demand, and what measures are they taking to make sure that also the supply of electricity that they're looking to generate, especially if there's new supply that's warranted, how that fits in with the needs and preferences of the customers that are looking to bring that demand. So that's, I think, one of the fundamental tension points that we're seeing is certainly affordability and reliability are two components that everybody really prioritizes, but especially for some of these new loads, like the tech companies that have decarbonization targets, they're trying to embed sustainability as one of the key pillars or legs of the stool alongside affordability and reliability. And for a lot of these regulatory bodies that haven't had to think about that piece, I think are now very much in need of sort of figuring out how they can be a part of the solution, and how their efforts are advancing some of what the new customers are demanding as well.
So are you seeing these data center developers considering a whole suite of sustainable technologies? Or, I mean, I imagine if you go where land is cheap, you can certainly build a large solar array, or if you're in West Texas, you can contract with wind developers. But are they also looking at geothermal? And I mean, certainly on-site storage is going to be important for anyone like that. Are you getting involved to that level of like seeing what they're
Yeah. This is exciting. So first, if you look at the news, right, there have been a lot of flashy announcements. 3 Mile Island is, being turned back online because the need for power is so much that we're looking to bring back nuclear. Or if you're talking about investing in nuclear fusion or new small modular reactor plants, that's one element. The geothermal piece, we've seen in Nevada, Google, Fervo Energy, and NV Energy, the utility in Nevada, work together to try to create a new clean transition tariff structure where the tech company that's bringing the demand wants that powered by clean energy. And so Fervo is the developer for geothermal, and then the utility is ultimately there in terms of actually negotiating the terms of the contract and getting regulatory approval from the Nevada Public Utilities Commission. So we're seeing things like that very much pop up. I think the tech companies are now starting to also become energy companies in a sense. If you just look at how big their energy expertise and teams are growing in-house, that's very, salient and present. And when you look at a whole suite of different technologies that they want to see deployed, that includes things now like grid enhancing technologies, advanced conductors, certainly distributed energy resources. Those are all part of the broader suite of technologies that a lot of these customers are now increasingly developing their own sophistication around and wanting to see deployed. The challenge, though, is we're not actually seeing deployment of those technologies to the full sort of optimized scale that certainly modeling experts would say we need. And if you think about something like grid enhancing technologies, now I had the privilege of being able to work back when I was still at the Loan Programs Office at the Department of Energy with colleagues across DOE on this liftoff report looking at grid modernization and advanced grid technologies. And grid enhancing technologies, also known as GETS, was very much one of the focus areas of that report. And the reason is because their payback period can be on the time scale of months as opposed to years. So certainly relative to building new transmission lines, they offer an incredible value proposition of being able to essentially unlock more effective capacity out of our existing infrastructure so we can get more juice out of our current grid while also saving customers a lot of money. So this should be a no-brainer type investment, but the reason why we're not seeing more of it is precisely because our regulatory structure is outdated, where we're not effectively compensating utilities and other stakeholders for the deployment of those because there's incentive misalignment, for instance. And so this is when we talk about the need to modernize our regulatory system, this is just one component, which is we need to ask ourselves to build the grid of the future that we ultimately want and know we need. what are the remnants of our existing infrastructure that will and won't get us there? And what are the things that we can do to make sure that some of those regulatory and policy mechanisms are, quote unquote, modernized in a way that allow us to actually get more juice out of our current system as we work to build new infrastructure?
Wow. I mean, the complexities go on and on. I think that there are the rate issues and revenue recovery issues for sure. And then what about, like, as you said, some of these technology companies becoming power companies? I can imagine there are, times when they might have waste heat or excess energy or whatever. And if they're, if you're dealing with more than one entity, more than one utility account number or whatever, then are they getting into that utility franchise question? And how are the regulators thinking about that? Or how are you and your organization dealing with that, approaching that?
It is a good question, because you're seeing anything from microgrids to sort of behind the meter gas turbines to even, some of the oil super majors like ExxonMobil are, just last year in 2023, I should say, they said, look, we're not going to be a electron company, we're a molecule company. But if you look late last year in November, December, ExxonMobil announced that they're selling electricity. They're selling electrons. So this, all the issues that we're talking about are changing very, very fast, right? Like from month to month, the dynamics change. Now, our regulatory bodies are not equipped to be that nimble in terms of changing on a dime like that. We actually are seeing, to your point, this is overwhelming to a lot of regulators, to a lot of advocates, to a lot of stakeholders, to a lot of utilities as well. So part of what we think needs to happen is we need to actually just take a pause, like take a breather, and plan effectively and not just rush things through, because we don't make good decisions when we rush everything through. There's a need to carefully scrutinize anything from load forecast to make sure that we're actually probabilistically looking at what the likely load to materialize looks like, so that we don't end up getting into a situation where we're overestimating the new electricity demand and underestimating the potential negative repercussions for, in particular, residential customers that currently face most of the risk, in some cases nearly 100% of the risk of these decisions. And so the work that our organization is trying to do, first off, we certainly recognize that there is this dynamic of risk that doesn't get talked about enough in terms of risk to the public, risk to residential customers. And we want to recenter the public interest in the conversation, because, Scott Hempling has been, in some sense, one of the leading thinkers and leaders on this issue of the role that regulatory bodies can and should play. And in his view, regulators need to lead and not preside. They need to actually have some North Star vision of where the future of our electricity system is going and play a proactive role rather than just calling balls and strikes. I think that's paramount in this paradigm, where we need some sense of leadership around where are we actually going and how do all the different pieces fit into the puzzle. But key to that is making sure that the public interest, and by proxy, in particular, residential customers and the affordability challenges that they're seeing, how they fit in. And just to add onto that real quick, I don't think we can underscore enough how important that is. The issues around energy affordability, energy burden, energy justice, because 1 in 3 Americans are struggling to pay for their utility bills. Utility bills are a non-negotiable expense, where if you can't pay for utility bills, your power will get shut off. And if your power gets shut off, you're not going to be able to, it doesn't matter if you can afford groceries or rent or education or not, if you can't even have access to electricity. And so I think we have definitely underestimated as a society, as a system, the concerns and challenges that everyday Americans are facing as it relates to these energy affordability issues that are only expected to get worse. And so if we don't effectively center the public interest in our regulatory system, that's, I think, a very risky proposition. And that is fundamentally core to how we are thinking about this issue and making sure that we are recentering the public interest, broadly speaking, in our regulatory system through a focus on who's in charge at these commissions, what laws are they responsive to, or what governs their statutory authority, and who they're listening to in terms of who's showing up at these public utility commission meetings or getting involved in these proceedings.
So these meetings are sometimes not the most exciting meetings in the world, or there's some barriers to getting involved. Have you had any success or have plans for getting more, kind of diverse new people, new energy involved in regulatory proceedings at the state level?
Well, it's a great question because it's interesting because I think that actually the public is increasingly interested in engaging on energy issues in a way that almost we haven't had to before. And frankly, that's actually in part because of the fact that we're feeling it as a society in terms of pocketbook impact. And I think one of the lessons from this election is that people are really concerned about pocketbook issues. People are really struggling in terms of being able to afford basic necessities. And I think there's actually an opportunity in the wake of this broader macroeconomic environment that we're in, where there's high inflation, where pocketbook issues are on people's minds, where there's this load growth dynamic in our electricity system, where there are significant changes. This is very much an inflection point in our electricity system. When we look back at this moment, at 2025, 10, 20 years from now, we're very much going to identify this being an inflection point in the way that the 90s and 2000s were for our grid. So there's increasingly public engagement on these issues, people asking questions about utility bills, why they've gone up, even when they've used the same amount or less energy. Because of grid outages and grid failures that we've always been able to take for granted, but that's popping up in Houston, where outages occurred for weeks this past summer. With certainly California and the wildfires is another dynamic where there's a really distorted irony where the biggest driver in electric bills in California has been investments in wildfire mitigation. At the same time, one of the biggest costs as a result of the LA wildfires is going to be wildfire risk. And you can quickly see how this is going to be a train that's going to lead us to the edge of the cliff in many ways if we don't get our act together and figure out, is this regulatory system actually designed in a way that's going to work? And I think increasingly the answer to that is being called into question. Now, the question is, can the relevant stakeholders come together and actually identify a path forward? And from our point of view, the public and consumers, particularly residential consumers, need to be central to that conversation, because ultimately that's who we set up our grid for, is for people to be able to access the benefits of our modern electric and grid system. And so if we forget that, then we're going to quickly, I think, pay the price for it.
I think that's a great note to close on. And given that the organization is so new, I'd love to start with that stakeholder group the next time we have you on the show in a few months or whenever makes sense, because I think it's going to really be interesting how it plays out. And I think that's a super important piece is you're raising the visibility of these issues to a greater and greater audience and mix of stakeholders. So congrats on getting this up and running, and
keep up the good work.
Yeah.
Well, thanks to both of you, and thanks to certainly the Synapse team. You all have really been leading on so many of these issues and have been actively engaged and representing a range of different entities that have played a key role in helping make sure that the system is working the way that it's designed to work. So really appreciate all the work that you all have done and for creating this platform to be able to share some of these thoughts and messages to a broader audience. So thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Jeannie. We've been at it for decades, though, and we haven't solved it yet. So there's room for new organizations. I'm glad you're here.
Lots of work for all of us.
That's right.
Good to see you.
Take care.